Your perspective on happiness and how do you think we can really stay happy?
Happiness is often defined as a state of one's mind, and it is characterized by our own feelings of contentment and satisfaction. It's very subjective, and it is based on our own personal feelings, our experiences, rather than anything which is an objective or external factor. So, happiness is a state that we tend to be in, um, and it's a question of how we look at life ourselves. And I must also state that happiness is something that changes and evolves as we grow older. But at the end of the day, when you come back, it is that old, not old, but it is the phrase which is aham brahman, which is I am the ultimate reality, right?
Correct.
And therefore, whatever happiness we are seeking is inside us. Most of us make, and I've done this, most of us assume that happiness is something we seek outside, when it's really something which is entirely within us.
Hi, I'd like to say hello to all my listeners, viewers, everybody here with me today. This is Ashu Khanna on the Happiness Hour. In our conversation today, I have with me a very special guest, Ashutosh Garg. There is so much that he's been doing for the last over 30, 40 years. He's worked in the corporate sector for 25 years with ITC Limited and then in the aerospace industry in India and overseas, moving on to becoming an entrepreneur after that. After a full innings in the corporate world, he brought Guardian Pharmacy to India and subsequently GNC as a nutraceutical partner as well in India. That was not enough for him. He decided to share and become a mentor and executive coach and became a certified executive coach, sharing his learnings and experiences with his clients. He's also a director of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, chairman of Bizdom, a startup incubator, member of the advisory council of the Center for Policy Research in Delhi, a member of YPO and charter member of TIE. He's written 9 highly acclaimed bestsellers, and his latest book, Seven Chakras of Management: Ancient Wisdom from Indic Scriptures, is expected to be published soon. A storyteller with a highly successful and the top-rated podcast series called The Brand Called You. And this is not all. He's a keen golfer. He plays the Indian flute and enjoys reading and listening to Indian classical music. So if I've missed anything.
Oh, no, thank you so much for that very, very generous introduction.
Welcome, Ashutosh. Thank you so much for agreeing to be our guest on our podcast series. And, I would like to really kick off by asking you, your perspective on happiness and how do you think we can really stay happy? This is something which is a question that puzzles or keeps everybody busy every day and every moment of their life,
Absolutely.
universally.
Absolutely. Great question, Ashu, to start your happiness podcast. And before I respond to your question, I think a podcast on happiness would, normally appeal to every single human being in the world, because aren't we all seeking happiness all the time? So my own perspective, Ashu, is that, happiness is often defined as a state of one's mind, and it is characterized by our own feelings of contentment and satisfaction. It's very subjective, and it is based on our own personal feelings, our experiences, rather than anything which is an objective or external factor. So, happiness is a state that we tend to be in, and it's a question of how we look at life ourselves. And I must also state that happiness is something that changes and evolves as we grow older. So I know that as my runway gets shorter and shorter in life ahead, my reason to be happy is very different from what it was when I started working after business school at 22 years old. Right. So, there are many different ways of being able to define happiness. And I guess each one of us has our own definitions.
So true. It keeps evolving as we evolve with life. I have absolutely seen that. And your runway is only getting wider, I think I would put it that way.
Absolutely. Wider, but there's always a finite runway ahead.
Well, let's make the most on that runway.
Absolutely.
And, how would you say that, all your transitions or various roles and relationships that you've had, or these roles of being a corporate leader, entrepreneur, a mentor, and a podcaster, author, there are various hats that you wear.
Mm.
How have you seen yourself transition through each of these evolutions that you've had,
Mm.
and still stay happy or find your happiness in each of them?
Mm. So, Ashu, I always think that I was blessed to have been given so many different opportunities. And I remember, my grandfather joined the government and he stayed. It was like a cradle to grave kind of job. No one ever thought what else he would do. My father was in the army. He joined the army, then left the army, joined the private sector. I was given many more opportunities. And I often say that for the generation after me, because the whole world is changing so much, today you can be in the corporate world, tomorrow you can be a musician, day after you can be an author, and then you can give yourself a break for 2 years, a sabbatical, and then you can come back again to doing whatever you want. So the world is changing, and we have our own ways of being able to find happiness all the time. But the way I have always looked at it is from a professional perspective. I've often said this and I've written about it, that when you are in a career like I was for 25 years, the day you start to feel unhappy in your job, which means that you're not content, and you are not being able to get the satisfaction that you think you deserve. And we all know in our own hearts what we deserve, whether it's realistic or not. Uh, I always said that that's the time for you to go to your boss and say, boss, I need a change, or it's time for you to make a change and look for something different. So therefore, I think in all the roles that I have had, I've always wanted to do something different at different stages in life. And that has been fortunate, where I have been able to get the opportunities. I've also often believed that the less expectations I have from others, the happier I am. So it's that old line, I'm sure you must have heard this from, or your elders. I all heard it many times, which is neki kar kuein mein dal,
Yeah.
which is don't have any expectations. If you don't have expectations, you don't have disappointments. And if you don't have disappointments, then logically you should be happier.
Yeah, logically, I like that part of it.
We're human beings, so therefore there are disappointments.
So I'm going to, segue here and ask you two things. You mentioned that each time you felt dissatisfied or felt you're not happy in what you're doing, and I have seen for myself that each time I felt this job or this role isn't giving me joy, I've moved on. And I find a lot of people find that very challenging. What has given you the courage to step away? Because there's always this fear of unknown which grips most people.
Hmm.
It's a question of you do it, you're damned, you don't do it, you're damned
Correct.
kind of thing.
Correct.
And how do you make that choice?
So I would say one of the very, very strong pillars in my life has been my wife.
Okay.
Stood by me. Whenever I decided to make a change, she stood by me like a pillar, and we've been married for 40 years. Um, I think that is one very important factor. The second is that my children, went out to study, are now very, very well settled in the corporate world in Singapore and America. And therefore, they were always, there for me. So every time I would think of making a change, I mean, for example, in my entire extended family, I was the only person who decided to become an entrepreneur when I started Guardian Pharmacy. And, I know people would always ring up my wife and say, what is he doing? He wants to become a chemist after being with such, and nobody understood me wanting to build a chain. At the end of it, when I started my first store, a lot of people would call my wife and say, how does he expect to fill your, dining, your food plate by selling croissant strips and so on? So, the world can be very, very uncomfortable, can ask difficult questions. But I think my family, my wife, my children, and before that, of course, my father, who I was very, very close to, they just stood behind me like a rock to say, okay, just go in and do what you think is right. And if you do falter, your family is with you.
So that's really wonderful. And you talked about doing what is right, like whether it is with expectations, do what is right and leave the rest. Similarly, when it's come to your work life, it's always been do what is right and leave the rest.
Correct.
And I think where I've seen a lot of people struggle is knowing what is right, because that whole noise that we have of the world and our social conditioning obstructs us from doing what is right. What other practices do you really follow so that you can stay anchored and keep doing what is right for you rather than listening to all the noise of the world?
So, Ashu, there are basically, I would say, three things that every parent teaches our children. And every parent means our parents, our grandparents. It is don't lie, don't steal, fear God, right? These are three things that we've always done. And therefore, whenever we are doing anything that we believe is not right, we internally know that this may not be right. But we still go ahead for whatever compulsions we may have. And those could be, compulsions relating to our careers. It could be compulsions relating to money. It could be compulsions relating to any other kind of desire, greed, whatever else we may have. But every single human being knows what is right and what is wrong. And most of us need to be able to develop the ability to say no. And I'll tell you an interesting story. Many, many years ago, when I was working for a large American aerospace company, I was, in China with one of my senior colleagues, and I asked him a simple question. I said, what is the difference between Chinese managers and Indian managers, or Chinese businessmen and Indian businessmen? He says, it's very interesting. It's very difficult to get a Chinese businessman to say yes. And it's very difficult to get an Indian businessman to say no. A long-winded answer to your question. But I think internally we all know what is wrong, what is right. And I'm not saying I have always done what is right. I have made many mistakes in my life. I've even written a book on failure. But I do believe that at some stage you are able to refocus your compass and come back to the true north, which is what I think is right for me.
Yeah. As you said, we all go the full circle and come back to where we started. And that's the journey of life. And that's the whole play of understanding and learning from our mistakes.
Absolutely.
However, still, like we said, it's a full circle. But in that circle, as we are journeying, people get busy, people get caught up, people get confused very commonly in thinking that success and wealth are the same as happiness.
Correct.
It's what will bring. We confuse
Correct.
material possessions with happiness till we go through that whole circle. What are your views on that, and what would you say there?
So, Ashu, again, the question that you asked me, if you had asked me this 40 years ago, my answer would have been different. 20 years ago may have been different. But I've also often said that the relationship between success, wealth, and happiness is very complex. And it varies from individual to individual. When I was 22, I was also, at a stage where I wanted to have the wealth. I wanted to get a big house. I wanted to have a big car, etc., etc. When you come to my stage in life, you're saying health is more important. One more zero added to your net worth is not going to change your lifestyle, and so on. But wealth is not a guarantee of happiness. Yes, when you have uh, lesser money, it can certainly alleviate certain stresses, you know, and those stresses could be, you know, how do I get my house organized? How do I get my food organized? How do I make sure that my children's education is paid for? How do I make sure that my health related topics are handled, or I have enough insurance, etc. But once your basic needs are met, and I must qualify, everyone's basic needs are very different.
That
So
is
at the
true.
end of the day, you can just have the same dal roti and whatever else you want. But there is also another very interesting factor, which is what are the cultural and societal uh, kind of environments that we live in?
Hmm.
Because different cultures, different societies, different environments play a different kind of uh, or develop a different kind of framework on what is the meaning of success and what is the meaning of wealth. So I think those are some of the factors that I would keep at the back of my mind when people talk about success and wealth being confused with happiness. And those are some of my factors that I would think about.
Yeah, I mean, in a world where we are constantly seeing the Forbes richest and it does, I think, overwhelm a lot of
Correct.
people and make people aspire for that,
Correct.
rather than sitting back and really questioning and asking themselves, what does it mean for me?
Hmm. So again, let me share an interesting story. About 25 years ago, uh, Freedom at Midnight, you know, the book that was
Hmm.
written by Dominic Lapierre and Larry Collins. Now,
Yep,
Dominic
yeah,
Lapierre had come for a YPO event to Delhi.
I remember.
And I remember asking him, what were some of your biggest surprises when you were traveling around in Calcutta? And he said that I had assumed that given the fact that there was so much poverty, people would be very unhappy. And I was surprised at how happy people were with the limited resources they had. And he says that was a big revelation to me coming from the Western world, where everything seemed to be determined with what are my worldly possessions, and therefore that should determine my happiness.
India clearly does stand out on that. I
Correct.
mean, I remember coming back from Singapore, although I'd grown up in India, and I used to go for a walk in the mornings on Marine Drive, and I would see a lot of these slum dwellers. They would wrap up their makeshift home and
Mm,
they would be back out there ready to work for the day. And I would not see a single tear or a frown or
correct.
anything. And that made me really sit back and ask myself, do I have any reason to complain?
Correct.
So, yeah, quite an eye opener.
Absolutely.
Uh, with you wearing so many different hats and doing
Mm,
so many different roles, how do you balance family, and you have a strong family connections and
mm,
relationships as well?
mm, mm.
How do you bring all of that together or keep that balance going, because life is never in balance?
Absolutely. So, I think I realized this in March 2003. Um, I was the first 20, 25 years of my life, like all people, I was only focused on my career. I was only focused on my work. And I think my wife, Veera, she held the whole family together because I was traveling 22 days a month.
Wow.
And I've often given this interesting story. Um, in a period of about 8 days, I had traveled from Delhi to Singapore, Singapore, Hong Kong, Hong Kong, Jakarta, Jakarta, Taiwan, Taiwan, Seoul. And I was lying in my bed at the Grand Hyatt in Seoul, looking at the ceiling at 6 a.m. in the morning, and I couldn't remember which country I was in. I had started forgetting room numbers, but I didn't know which country. And I said, this is too much. And therefore, I said, enough is enough. I said, let me change my life completely. I mean, I'd missed all my children's parent-teacher meetings. I had, was never available at home, socially, not available, and so on and so forth. But since then, in the last 20 years, I made a significant change in my life. I was always available for children. I was always available for my wife. Tried my best to be available all the time. Also, I started to start defining my own boundaries. So first thing I did was I set very clear boundaries for my work. And even after so many years, after 7 p.m., for example, my phone goes onto my study table and I don't look at it till I wake up early in the morning. We also started to make sure that we are conscious of our health, because as you get older, it's important to make sure your physical health and your mental health are both something that you are conscious about, and you take steps to ensure that you remain as physically fit as possible. So when I play golf, I could happily play 18 holes twice a week. Happiness is a state of the mind. How you maintain your work-life balance is something which is entirely dependent on how you look at your own immediate surroundings, your own friends, your own family, and your whatever else you have.
So it's obviously a lot of constant reflection, and constantly tweaking
Correct.
your life. And like you said, drawing boundaries.
Correct.
The beginning, you said that we Indians are not the best, and I totally agree.
Absolutely.
And it's learning to draw those boundaries and being okay with it, because today we live in an era where there's so much of this whole concept of FOMO that drives people. So it's really great to hear from. I think it'll be very helpful for people to know that ultimately the secret to happiness is not suffering from FOMO, but learning to draw your boundaries and
Correct. Correct.
learning to refocus.
And you read a lot of the Vedas, and you were talking
Yeah.
about the 4 segments of the yoga. But at the end of the day, when you come back, it is that old, not old, but it is the phrase which is Aham Brahman, which is I am the ultimate reality, right?
Correct.
And therefore, whatever happiness we are seeking is inside us. Most of us and I've done this, most of us assume that happiness is something we seek outside, when it's really something which is entirely within us.
Really spot on. I mean, this is, like you said, the truth of life. And that is where everybody needs to come to, saying it's all about turning inwards rather than staying focused outwards. Latest book that is about to be released, a little about the 7 chakras of management. If you can share any nuggets or...
No, I will certainly be happy to do that. There are 7 major religions in the world. Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Sikhism, Jainism, Buddhism. I was fortunate when the pandemic started to have done a program from Harvard on each of these religions. And there is so much to draw from the 4 Indic religions, which is Hinduism or Sanatan Dharma, Sikhism, Buddhism, and Jainism. So I said that there are so many subjects that I've addressed in my life, whether you look at something as simple as anger management, or whether you look at something like diversity, equity, inclusion. Let me just take these 2. So much has been written in our scriptures. The famous story of Lord Ram when he was wanting to cross the waters to go to Lanka, and Varun, the sea god, wasn't giving him a way. He took out his bow and he said, I'm going to burn the river. First time I think they've ever shown Lord Ram get angry.
Yeah.
And Varun, sea god, came and said, please forgive me. You put stones with your name on it and I will make sure they don't sink. Now, that was an interesting story. The second one was of Lord Krishna and Sri Khandi, where he said, I will allow you to abuse me 100 times, because that's the commitment I have made to my Mausi, who was Sri Khandi's mother. And as he was counting, the moment he crossed 100, the Sudarshan Chakra came out and he knocked off his head. So that's, when you suddenly start to relate, you say, yeah, there are challenges of anger management. There's nothing wrong in getting angry, but there is a way to be able to recover yourself. The other one, which is on diversity, equity, inclusion, the whole world is talking of diversity, equity, inclusion now. But what I wanted to bring out in my book is that there has been respect for women for a long time in our scriptures, But if you think of the Saptarishis, the
Mm.
7 stars, which are also
Yeah,
referred
yeah.
to as the Great Bear or the Big Dipper, one of the 7 stars is a twin star constellation, which is Rishi Vashisht and Rishika Arundhati, his wife. And this twin star constellation is unlike what we normally see where the earth is fixed and the moon revolves around. This twin star constellation revolves around each other, right?
Yeah, even if you look at all our gods and goddesses, there's always a consort and it's a equals
Correct.
relationship. So, scriptures have, of course, been my guiding light, as you
Yeah.
know, in a
Yeah.
very big way. And recently, I met with the professor from the Harvard Divinity School, and we were
Mm.
talking about, when you talked about the various 7 main religions,
Mm.
somebody I know has done a book on the common themes within these religions.
Mm.
And where it all comes down to is that one truth, which we all know.
Mm.
Ultimately, it comes to one truth. And if we look at the world as a whole again, the happiness within is where it again comes back to.
Correct.
Happiness, I believe, is a choice we all make.
Mm.
It's not just an accident, it's something we all choose and have to stay on it, that course
Mm. Mm.
of making that choice consciously every day. A lot of our religions, our great sages have given many, many practices,
Correct.
rituals, techniques, tools, anything that you think has specially worked for you, which you would like to recommend or suggest to our listeners, other
And
than
one
reading
thing,
all these.
no, one thing is, I mean, I can talk about practicing mindfulness, for example, is very important. Be present in the moment. I've often, and I just spoke about putting my phone aside, which I've often referred to as a digital detox. You know, get away from all the connections that you have all the time, maintain close relationships, develop new skills. You know, I used to play the flute when I was in my early 20s. Then I stopped it completely. And the last 5 years, I picked up the flute again. In fact, just before I started recording with you, I finished the flute class. So with my Guruji who comes home. So there are many different kind of things that you do, but there are also one thing that has always stood me in very good stead, and that is a copy of the Hanuman Chalisa, which my mother gave me when I was 5 years old, going to hostel. And that Hanuman Chalisa, which I know by heart, has traveled with me for the last 61 years everywhere in the world. The same book is with me. It's been received many covers after that, but the same original book is with me. And it is just, it's like that old one of having, when you're children, you have a blanket or you have a special toy. But I know that this Hanuman Chalisa gives me a lot of uh,
Comfort.
comfort, in the sense
Yeah.
that, if I'm stressed, I recite it to myself. If I'm on a plane which is going through turbulence, I recite it to myself. If I'm not being able to sleep, I recite it to myself. So there are many ways that I have, done. And of course, the other part is that as one got older, I actively worked on 2 things. One was no gossip and remove negativity. And, I practiced that for the last 10, 15 years, quite a bit. I just think it makes me much more at peace with myself.
Before we close this conversation today, is there any one line that you would like to leave our listeners with?
I would say it's entirely within you to stay happy, and yet it needs very little to be happy. If the day we stop thinking of why does someone have something I don't, is the day I will be a very happy person. And this does not at all mean that I'm suggesting that, oh, you become a monk and give up everything. By all means, run fast, run hard, aspire for whatever you want, achieve everything that you want, but do it within your own boundaries, define what your own parameters are, and certainly never try to compare how much you have with someone who has more or someone who has less.
Thank you so very much, Ashutosh, for this, for sharing your journey of discovery to what is makes you happy,
Thank
and
you.
drawing your own parameters and boundaries, and yet living a very fulfilled and holistic life. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Ashu. Thank you very much.